So, you want to build a broadband network. What are the 5 questions you need to ask? So, joining me today, I'd like to bring up Tom Asp, who is a principal engineer and business analyst for CTC Technology out of Kensington, Maryland. And then from Lexington, Kentucky, Terry Barnes, who is the project manager and the business consultant for the Solarity Group, and a long career in, well, I almost say long, a few years in the a number of years in telecom business. And then also, because we are about local leaders, so, you know, these are guys with engineering degrees and technical experience, and join us right over here, there. But what would be the first 5 questions that a local elected leader would ask? So I'm going to bring up our county judge from Bell County, Mr. Albie Brock. And I'm going to ask him to join the gentleman over here to the right. And we're going to have a dialogue, if you will, about the first 5 questions you should ask yourself. But first, I want to try to set this discussion up. Over there, on that side. Thank you, Judge. First of all, I want to say this. When we talk about munis, you know, we are so bad in this industry to have our own little acronyms in our lingo. And so when we talk about a muni in this particular, it may be a city, it might be a county, it might be multiple cities or counties that have come together to form a cooperative or a joint venture in some sort. But it's really meaning that local network, the local folks. It's not one of your telephone cooperatives, it's not Windstream or those folks. And that's the difference. It's a public sector. You may create a separate LLC in your community to do it, but it is the public good. It is not a private for-profit entity. But we very often just refer to that as a public entity or as a muni, as we shortchange them. So, Larry, do we have that slide that Terry provided? As one of the things that Doug said, which resonated so well, that never has he been in a community where it all looks the same. And that's one of the things I want, as you begin to think about your community and how you would do it, what are your assets, what are your resources? You know, maybe you have a big user like the mayor here might have, but maybe you don't. Maybe you have a big medical facility, but nothing is ever, again, it's not cookie cutter and it's not all the same. But we do sort of throw them into 3 principal models. And this is just for generic to try to get our hands around. What about ownership of these? And so first one would be the private investment and public facilitation. And that really means you basically, as the public or the muni, have to encourage or enable or entice someone from the private sector to bring it over. An example might be the Google fiber deployments. You could have an incumbent telephone provider, like one of our co-ops or an existing one, to come over and entice them to come in, and they make the investment, but you give them some resources to help in doing that. The private execution, the public funding, is where you have the private partner takes responsibility for the design and the construction of everything, but it's funded by the public. You do the tax bonds, revenue bonds, whatever. A good example of this would be or it could be private sector coming in, money, venture capital. That would be the Kentucky Wired and Macquarie Capital model. And then number 3 is the public-private shared investment and risk. And that takes, again, a lot of different looks, but the public builds the dark fiber, lights it, may run it, may hire someone else to come in. Westminster, Maryland, I think, is one. Huntsville, Alabama is another example of what's going on there. So just for the sake of this discussion, when we talk about owning a network or the possible ownership models, this is what we look at. The thing that I really want you to think about as we go through this are risk, benefits, and control. And you all can see the private investment public has a low risk, obviously, and basically no control. Whereas Model 2, with the private execution and public funding, you have high risk, high benefits, because you know it's there, you can operate it, and then you have moderate control. Model 3 gives you moderate, high, and moderate. So just kind of keep that in your mind as we have the discussion about what you need to think about in terms of, if you're sitting here, maybe you're the head of your chamber or your community development, what is it that you need to start asking, thinking about, inquiring about, learning about in order to make a decision or to gather your people together to make a decision? So I'm going to start off with Terry Barnes. And Terry, I have a question from you, and that question was, let me find it. I'll be over here. It was about what were, there, you took my paper from me, took my questions, you're cheating. Why is the decision to build a fiber to the premise or fiber to the home or fiber to the curb network different from any other capital decision a local government entity would make?
So how many folks do we have out there that are part of a local government? So if your community needed a new fire truck, for example, would your community know how to go about doing that? Would you know how to develop the specifications, issue the RFP, evaluate the RFP, and make your selection?
Absolutely, all of them would. I can answer that.
Yeah. So a slide we use at Solarity a lot shows you starting here thinking about your broadband network and your requirements. Hear me okay?
A little closer.
Okay.
Maybe we turn on. Is it on?
It's on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. And the point of that slide is that it's not a direct line from where you start to where you finish if you're looking at a broadband network. There are so many variables. And one of the key points in trying to determine what those variables are is to understand what your community strategy is. How does your community want to approach this? And making sure that you have your community involved in it. But it's also, and Tom can really speak to this in a lot of detail, it's also understanding the components of that feasibility study that Doug mentioned. Your cost analysis, and also your take rate. What kind of revenue are you going to be able to derive from the network? The one piece that is also important is what is the public willing to do? What are you willing to do from a public facilitation standpoint as far as permitting, right-of-way access, easement access? Those types of things can always help your community be more attractive to a private investor if you're willing to do that.
Thank you. So, Tom, one of the questions, because I asked them to give me their questions and what they would do. So, one of the things I asked Tom said is, what is the relationship between ownership, financing, and securing that financing? Well, how would you as a county judge or elected leader or community leader think about that question?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of the different models out there that they'll come up to you and tell you, get this kind of slick guy in a nice suit and well-pressed suit and mannered.
About the judge over there now?
Yeah. But they'll come up to you, community, and say, I got a deal for you. We're going to come in, we're going to build, maintain, design, operate, and own this network for you. You don't have to do anything. We're going to take all the risk and all that. And at the end of 30 years, we're going to come in and we'll give you the network. And no risk at all to you. And all we ask is a little anchor tenant payment from you. And that's it. And there's really no risk on that anchor tenant payment because, we're going to make so much money on retail services off in this network that's going to cover your anchor tenant payment. And usually when somebody comes up to you and offers something that sounds way too good to be true, it usually is. And one of the things, and you look at this kind of the second model, what's model 2 on the slide, and that's basically the model that is pitched, is that they'll come in, own, operate, maintain, build, design, and do everything for you, and you have to have that anchor tenant payment. But that anchor tenant payment is, so you're not owning it, you're not having to go out and financing it, you're not having to do anything in that regards. But that commitment of that payment is going to go against your bonding capacity of your community, because that commitment that you have to make for that payment is just as strong as if you were going to own and operate it yourself. So I think you really have to kind of get in and understand it. So there are some of these models that even though you may not own the network, you are ending up on the hook for all its debt service and all its operation and maintenance costs.
And then you have
So
no
it's-
control over it.
And
if
then you
they
have
don't
no
perform.
control over it.
Is that also with the revenue bond or just straight payment?
This is you're not issuing in that case, you're not issuing a bond. They'll come out and they'll arrange the financing for you. And so you're not actually having to go out and do a bond yourself. However, the bonding community will look at that commitment and say, that's going to go against your general obligation bond borrowing capacity, because that commitment has to be so strong, because that security, they're using your commitment of that payment to go out and secure the financing, and they're using that to they're acquiring a revenue bond based on your commitment to provide that revenue.
So
And-
does the ownership objective then conflict with other common municipal broadband objectives?
Well, I think on any of these models, when you really start taking a look and saying, hey, what are kind of really the 5 questions that you're really asking, the first thing is saying, why are you doing this? Why are we even talking about it? And really understand what your goals, your objectives, your vision, what are you trying to accomplish? And then saying that in order to accomplish that, what type of services, what type of performance, what type of items are needed to reach that objectives? And then taking a look at what are your really core competencies? What are some of the things that you can bring to the table? What are some of the things that you're comfortable in doing? And maybe it is offering a dark fiber or building an infrastructure, kind of treating that infrastructure just like a road or a sewer type project. But then when it gets into lighting the electronics and all that, maybe a private party is better served, to do that. Once you get into the network operations, that's a whole different leap going on skill sets away from kind of going on dark fiber. So kind of what are some of those skill sets that you might not be that great at? One of the things common early on in this industry, a lot of municipal electrics jumped into the cable TV and the broadband business and the telephone business, and they thought, I'm in a municipal electric utility, I know sales and marketing, and I know how to go out and do these things. But actually, a municipal electric is actually just serving, they're a monopoly electric provider. They don't really know how to sell and market. And so it's not really a core competency of them. And so it's kind of looking at what's this balance of things that you can do well, what are some of the things that you want to try to do, and what are some of the help and activities that you'd want to look at others performing. And then kind of coming up with a model of kind of saying, what fits into it, what model would fit all those pieces. And then I think the core one, I guess it's 6 questions, but it's more of saying, how do you pay for it all? Are you expecting this to be a standalone business, a standalone self-supporting thing, or is it going to take ongoing funds and continuing? And, one of the questions I could take a look and say, what is Huntsville, Alabama, Westminster, Maryland, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Salisbury, North Carolina, and Tacoma, Washington? What do they all have in common?
They're bigger than Moorhead.
Yeah, I think none of them on a standalone basis can cash flow their network. Each one of those networks takes a degree of other funds coming into it to support that network. And each one of them had their different reasons. Some of the cases, I think some of the biggest ones, in the case of like Tacoma and Salisbury, they walked into it expecting that it was going to be a standalone operating enterprise. And it kind of caught them by surprise that when it didn't work out the way they had thought it was going to work out. Whereas the other Chattanooga, Huntsville, Westminster, all understand that there's other funds that were required to maintain that network, but they made a decision early saying, we think the long-term benefits will justify having other types of general fund expenditures to keep their models going. Each one has a completely different model, but very similar outcomes.
So, Judge, we're hearing, talking about the details of putting these models together and the complexity of it, whether it's funding or what type of technology you're going to have. You, a few years ago, when this first started talking about Kentucky Wired, you became very energized from Bell County and said, you know, this is something I'm really interested in. And now we're still kind of waiting on Kentucky Wired. We're going to get an update on that this afternoon about the status of it. But as a judge, and you looked at this rural county in southeastern Kentucky, what were the things that you had to, in your mind, ask yourself the question, clearly understand where you were going down that path as you began to talk about it, and in a way put your own political career out there by talking about broadband that probably a number of your residents didn't know about or care about 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, you know, this broadband issue, and I'm sure, at least from a local government perspective, you know, it's a box of snakes, pure and simple. I mean, you open it up
The
and...
good snakes. They're
Well,
good
when I
snakes,
say a box of
Judge.
snakes, I'm saying it from everybody's afraid of a box of snakes.
Ah.
And, you know, Mr. Dawson, if I had had him 2 years ago in my phone, I think we would be further along. But I think it's important to understand that we're talking about the last mile. There's really 3 things going on here. You've got the first mile, the middle mile, and the last mile. Well, this last mile piece is where local governments, the mayor, you know, folks looking at it to be a utility. So as Ms. Legg alluded to, as soon as it became apparent that, okay, we're going to have broadband,
We're gonna have a
what
middle
does
mile.
that mean? Well, to the folks that are in rural communities, they thought that meant they were going to have broadband at their house. Well, we're nowhere close to that, at least in my county, and we've been looking at it for quite some time. So we went about the business of trying to write grants under the Brashear administration that were going to fund studies for folks like Mr. Dawson. So when Governor Bevan came in, he took a hard look at it and said, you know, I may want to make some tweaks and some changes to this. And he did do that, which fundamentally changed the path that we're on today. So he alluded to the guys in the slick suits that come to your office. I'm sure the mayor and the judge both have had them come and say, hey, you know, sign up right here and let me represent you in all your broadband negotiations, you know, moving forward. I've not done that yet, and I don't recommend that anybody do that, because I don't think anybody other than Mr. Dawson, you're going to say his name 10 times, knows probably more specific about what we need to know than any of the rest of it. But you said, what questions do you come up with? And both these guys mentioned several questions that we came up with, and I'll add a few to that. You know, obviously, how much will it cost? How much will it cost to maintain it after it's over? Mr. Dawson, yet again, alluded to an answer to that question is maybe you build it with your bonds and contract with, you know, someone else to run it, a company that comes in and runs your utility. To follow up on the bond question, the industrial development bonds is often what that's referred to that, you know, he's speaking of, and obviously the bond sale pitch on that is this: you're not obligated for them. They're not general obligation bonds. You're not going to have to raise taxes if we fail on these, but it does negatively impact your overall bond capacity in order to be able to use it.
Yep.
Another question that came up when we couldn't answer all those questions, or in my mind, was why isn't AT&T already doing this? If it's profitable, they've got the poles, they've already got the easements, why aren't they doing it? That led me to a question of, if I find out it's profitable and we can afford to do it, who's going to sue me?
The legal implication.
Who's going to try to stop me? Because if we're putting out a utility and I'm going out and getting wireless service, if I'm stealing that service away from somebody, are they just going to let me do that and move on? I've not seen them be so friendly. It's a lot like trying to take a railroad track. Try that. So who's going to fight me? That was a big piece of the puzzle. And in the event that we end up in a fight, who's going to win? So that led back to Mr. Dawson. Somebody's going to have to do a study, an extensive one, in all these communities, mine, yours, to where we can say this is the take rate. No, AT&T's not going to sue you. Spectrum, I have Spectrum in my community. I don't know what's here and round. They're just going to lay down and let you have at it. They're not going to fight you at all. It's going to take somebody like Mr. Dawson that's done it before to come into my local government and sit down and say, hey, here's a very comprehensive study, one that could stand the scrutiny of a bond sale, which if you're in local government, you know that is a high bar. I know Ms. Legg has been involved in bond sales for years. They don't just sell municipal bonds without making sure that they're going to get paid. That's why they're such a safe investment, is because they've been scrutinized and analyzed to do that. So those were a few of the things that came up on my side that maybe these guys can answer the questions to. Why isn't AT&T doing it?
Well, I might even,
All right.
because you can't make money in the low demographic concentration. And if you're a private sector and you're controlled by a board of directors that's profit motivated, you have to turn a profit, or they're not going to keep you very long. And it just simply hasn't been the demand. In fact, AT&T no longer has to build out to the last mile, as you mentioned, anymore, because if you build a home right next to your mother's home to take care of her, then if there's no landline, they don't have to bring you a landline. And so it is the world that we are in and changing. And that's why the burden almost has come to local government and local communities, because as the demand for broadband and interconnectivity and the role that plays in economic development has grown, there has been less of the private sector in our rural areas and in that last mile of the rural areas that, we lose in population. We're not growing customers, and you might be in Bell County, but I doubt it. We're losing them. So there's no demand for the private sector to come in. And so this burden of, if you will, or challenge of providing this big new pipe of interconnectivity in rural Kentucky or rural anywhere has fallen to local entities. And a couple of things that Tom said, and I want to get back and follow up on it, but a couple of things he talked about was, the local people are now having to absorb this and look at it. And if you form your own, are you going to form a municipal network, or are you going to run it? You're not used to running. Most local governments and many of our mayors, particularly, and judges sometimes, have other businesses and other endeavors on the side. They're not an expert in technology. No. And so are they going to be expected to run a telecom company like a Keith Gabbert that's been running a telephone company for years and years and years, or a Windstream or anyone else? And so there's a whole new skill set that's involved there. But we can get to that a little bit later, but I want to go back because the judge here was talking about the feasibility study. So let's say a municipal is looking to conducting a feasibility study. You have a handout that I thought was excellent. Why don't you share that, and then people can get it later. But from your company's perspective, what recommendations should these folks in these communities take to their fellow community people in talking about, do we do a feasibility study? Because there are going to be a lot of charlatans out there. Somewhere, whenever we get the big mile, they'll show up.
Yeah, and one of them, kind of the first handout I have, I call it the Tipmont 10, and this is one kind of a long-term colleague of mine. I've been working with him on a number of fiber projects over the year, and his latest endeavor, he's the CEO of Tipmont Rural Electric Cooperative in Tipmont, Indiana. So it's kind of written from a point of view of an rural electric cooperative. So, so there's some little nuances there, but it kind of gets into, he's done a couple of different systems. Actually, over the years, I've helped him deploy a couple of different fiber to the home projects when he's been with other municipalities. And so over time, he's kind of, he's very, very outspoken in opinions. And one of the things, kind of stealing a phrase from him is, getting into the fiber business is kind of like Hotel California. is you can check out, but you can never leave on that, because especially, it's really a long-term investment, and you really want to make sure that you're really looking at it, really eyes wide open and jumping into it. And I think from him, he kind of pushes that, hey, this is a completely different business. If you're a municipal electric or just a straight municipal or a city or a rural electric cooperative, this is something completely different from anything that you've done before. It is, a lot of people will talk about, well, this is, the internet has become an essential service and it really is a utility. Yeah, it really has in becoming more and more of an essential service, but it's not a utility because from a regulation standpoint, it's not a utility. You don't get, when you get into terms of a utility, your electric company, how many choices of electric companies do you have at your home? You have one. They're a monopoly. They're a utility. Your water supply, what's your competitors of supplying water services and sewer services in the community? Yeah, that's a utility, but yeah, you can call the fiber a utility, but there's still other choices, even though in a lot of cases there's some bad choices, but there's still some other choices. So it's a different business that you're jumping into it. The other thing is the cavalry is not coming to save your town or community. There's no provider that's going to come rolling into town and spend a lot of money and do this. So, don't get in a panic and sign a bad deal. Think it through, be cautious, make sure you know what you're doing. I think there's kind of a misconception here in Kentucky, especially, when it was first being announced about Kentucky Wired. And you talked about, kind of the perception of residents as saying, yeah, I read about Kentucky Wired, problem solved, let's go home. Kentucky Wired does not even get into the middle mile in your community or the last mile in your community. What Kentucky Wired is going to bring you is an affordable way to access the internet and buying raw commodity bandwidth, because they'll bring that into your community, and that's what you'll be able to buy from them. They're not going to build and solve your last mile infrastructure. So that, I think that's another misconception here in the state or the Commonwealth on that, Kentucky Wired is not going to save you, although their Kentucky Wired partner will talk about coming in and save you, but they have some nice slick suits. Not to name anybody by specifically, but the other thing is make sure your house is in order. And, once you start moving forward, with this, you're not going to have a lot of time to play defense. You got to really, and especially like in municipal electric or making sure that your attachments, your poles are clean, making sure that you get your organization, make sure your policies are in place, and kind of really making sure that you're ready to handle this new endeavor. And then I think another one is, I've been a consultant, and Doug's been a consultant, we've done hundreds, combined together, is, it's important that you're going to own this. At the end of the day, as a consultant, we'll go in and help you and help advise and help steer you. But at the end of the day, we go home. You still have to be there and own it and operate it and live with it. So the key thing, Ron really pushes really hard saying, do an internal feasibility study. You can have an external one done, use that for leverage, but really task your staff to really kind of understand it, understand all the assumptions, understand the variables, and really understand it and get your staff and people to own it. Because if they don't own it, it's not going to work. They have to buy into it. And I can go in and any of these feasibility studies, I can change 4 or 5 variables, and boy, these things look really bad, or boy, they look really good. And so you got to really understand, kind of what you're getting into.
Sounds like a box of snakes.
Yep, exactly. And then kind of give your staff time to learn. And this is even in a dark fiber, and it gets even more and more complex as the more you get into network operations and lighting it and getting in customer service and marketing.
And before you go to the next one, I just want to plug, that's one of the reasons that we've encouraged our local communities to bring more than one person to these workshops, because you do need kind of the guy that has the numbers and the guy that knows about the engineer. You've got a team of people around you that are interested. And later on, Larry and I will talk about establishing local boards in your communities and how important that is. So I just want to make you think about that as Tom is going through the list of things, the questions that you should be asking yourself.
So another one is work closely with your board. In the case of municipalities, maybe the city council, town councils, but the reporting board structure, get them to buy in and understand what's going on. Don't allow them, of course, to try to get into the day-to-day nitty-gritty details, but from a strategy standpoint, it's really important to understand what the cause and effect. And like in the case of like Tipmont, they're walking into this understanding that in the end, the electric utility is owning it, and there's going to be they're going down the path of being the retail type provider in that, and they're walking in understanding that they're not expecting this new business to cash flow 100% on its own. They're looking at actually there's some subsidies that would be being circled around for some external benefits from the electric utility operation that will be absorbing part of the cost and allocations onto it. But if they stood alone, a standalone enterprise, they're not really expecting it to be a cash flow positive entity. So, and really getting, letting your, elected officials, your board, the reporting structures, if you go down, whatever path you go, what is the ongoing funding implications? Is it something that you got a goal of it being a standalone on its own operation, or is there other external funds used to keep and support that operation and keep that going? And understanding that and making that conscious decision up front is a lot better than having to deal with expecting one outcome and then seeing a completely different one. One of the other things I've done, spent a lot of years in my life, is following other consultants and kind of cleaning up a lot of cash flow messes. There's a lot of great examples out there, but there's a lot of bad examples out there too. And it's not an easy thing, to do. And then really kind of gets into, whenever possible, take a look at, is there ways to phase it? Is there ways that you can kind of slowly build the business rather than all of a sudden trying to snap your fingers and building out to 100% of people right away? Although politically you're going to have a lot of pressure to, so that's one of the challenges of a municipal entity versus the private sector of how can you phase it and how you can do it.
Because
And
all they're going to come back to the judge when he puts
Yep.
an infrastructure in that goes to his industrial park and where his demographic base and concentration is in Pineville, one of those. And then he maybe goes out one line because there's some common reason to go out that rural road, then every other person that lives on every other rural road in Bell County is going to know why they don't have it. So
Yep.
I think that's a really important thing that you do have to understand in terms of the phasing piece of it. But
Yep.
you do get your money and you're able to build and see, and you're also able to learn your system as you go along, what's working, what didn't work, what
Yep.
were your surprises along the way. And you do it in a bit of a safer zone because you're in the concentrated demographic region, where your revenue stream is better.
Yep, exactly. And then, kind of like I said, to kind of understand where failures have occurred. And I think even the ones that are talked about great, understanding how those economics really work. Like in Chattanooga will be touted as one of a great example of a municipal. And they've met all their objectives. They're doing great things. They brought a lot of economic development activities into the community, but as a standalone enterprise, it doesn't cash flow. They walked into it understanding that they were going to allocate, the first thing, they got 50% of the funding from the federal government for the outside plant. The other 50% they allocated to the electric utility operations. And then there's a portion of the operation and maintenance of the fiber. They're paid for the under the electric utility rates, which is all approved under their regulator, the TVA. But unless you had municipal electric and you operated under rules that you could do that type of allocation, you're not necessarily going to be able to replicate that. So it's really important to understand the models that are touted as being successes. They're successes, but you have to understand the rules of how they're being viewed as being a success or not success. And I think that's really critical.
Say something to that. That's a huge point if you're in local government looking at doing one of these. Because if it doesn't cash flow, if it doesn't pay for itself, by that being its operations if you chose to maintain those, but at a minimum the debt service piece, then it can't work. Because I can assure you that I see Representative Couch here, and I think Representative Stewart is also here with him. And I'll ask Representative Couch, is there any intention for the state legislature to subsidize local government in the event we get into a broadband deal and it doesn't cash flow.
Senator, I'll take you off the hook.
I know, but that, coming from you, it means something.
Yeah.
There are no immediate plans. Is
Yeah.
that right, Senator? That's what you said.
And we know that that's not gonna happen, okay? So if you're looking at it from a local government standpoint, he made a very good point. And I've heard the Chattanooga model. You know, that's something that, you know, we had looked at. Well, if Chattanooga can do it, can we do it? Even though we're geographically different. But the key is it must be able to cash flow out and pay its debt service. So that's a huge piece of any study that you do, unless, Judge, you've got extra income and you just want to be the fiber fairy for your citizens, and you're going to say, okay, I've got X amount of surplus revenue a year and I'm going to put it into this.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, and there's some examples of having a fiber ferry too, though.
Yeah.
Like Sebling, Michigan is one. It's a small little community, about 1,000 people onto that. When they had the cash, and they just paid cash for the fiber network. And with no expectations, the village commission basically said, yeah, I have, they're also municipal electric, and they'd built up reserves over the years. And they looked at it and said, yeah, you know, we'd want fiber, we'll do it. I got cash in the bank, we'll build it. And I think in the first 18 months, they were also in an area where Comcast was the cable provider, but the quality of their network was so bad that even the pictures on their cable TV were snowy. And so they were able to get, within the first 24 months of going in, building fiber to the home and becoming, and they brought in a local ISP to help run the operation. But they were able to get up to about 60% penetration in under 24 months, which is kind of a unique situation because of their competitive position and all that. But there are cases where, yeah, there is some cash and those type of things that do happen.
There are some models out there as well where even if they had some government funding, match monies, or did it on their own, where I know one particular community has about $18 million of their own money, it's a county community, invested in their network, and they are realizing it's just too big for them to operate, and so they're going to sell it, and they'll put it on the sale, and at the end of the day, they have still bettered they've got 18 million in it, but whoever comes in and buys it would, you know, they'll have where they operate it, and so they have that investment in the ground. They have a fiber network in the ground that they know is going to contribute to their economic base. They know they've already competed with the local cable company, and, you know, so, I mean, it doesn't always work out the way you think it's going to work out, but there are sometimes you can do that. But that leads me into the next question I want to ask Terry, and I don't want to take away from, we have a session this afternoon on community engagement, but one of the things that I know that Terry thinks is an important question to ask yourself, Judge, would be, why is important, how much do I engage my community, and why is that important to engage my community? So don't steal Nancy's show, but I think that's one of the things you need to think, because you got to get your community behind you, and if you've got a local provider in part of your community, let's just say you got a county and you got a municipal cable network, which is pretty common around here, how are you going to get your community people to switch over to you? Alby's worried about being sued, but the point is you're going to need some loyalty and you're going to need some support. So why do you put that as one of your questions, Terry?
Before I go there, if I could, Hilda.
Well, I guess, but go ahead. Yeah.
And I no way compare Lexington to a lot of the communities in eastern Kentucky. I know Lexington is much more fortunate than a lot of those communities. But, and we've talked a lot about snake oil salesmen here today. But one way, and I know Tom and CTC have been valuable to Lexington in doing this, one way for a community to get to the point where it can understand what its options are, what models might work for it, is to use an RFI process. It's to do a lot of the background work that the judge and Tom and Doug have all talked about. But that RFI can help you get folks to the table and help you start exploring models and different ways that your community might move forward.
Well, take that RFI means request for information, just.
Yes.
And
that's
what
a-
would you get if you did an RFI, Terry?
Well, and again, I know Lexington is not Eastern Kentucky, but we actually had 12 different entities come to us with proposals. We went through those proposals. 2 of the proposals were from the incumbents in Lexington. And again, it allows you in a structured way to sit down, look at what they're proposing, talk to them about what they're proposing, and see how that might work for your community. But in the background, you have to understand yourself. You have to understand what your cash flow requirements are, what your bonding requirements are. So you have to do that legwork and know what your strategies are before you go to that RFI.
Okay. Now, community.
So if you went out to the folks in your community and you asked them how important is it for you to have a gig of service, what kind of a look or answer would you get? Many of your constituents would just give you a blank look because they wouldn't understand what you were asking them. So a lot of what a community has to do, the community leaders have to do, is education. Help your community understand not just what it is today, but as Doug talked about, what it's going to be next year and the year after that. How much more the Internet of Things is going to play into your everyday life. How much more telemedicine is going to play into your everyday life. What there is beyond Netflix. Because if you as a political leader are going to move forward with this and take the risk associated with this, you really need to have your community behind you, and they really need to understand what you're doing and why you're spending your money on this instead of some other options that you have. So again, community engagement from the beginning and to build on that is really important.
So what I'm going to do is give the audience a chance to ask you all questions. But before I do that, I'm going to give you a chance, and Tom, I'm going to start with you to make one last, driving point. If you are the leader in your community in some capacity or involved, what do you need to think about? What do you want to make sure you think about as you start this endeavor?
Well, I think really starting out with understanding what your really goals and objectives are on the plate, and understanding how you're going to measure what's success, non-success, and what are some of the things that you want to look at. And there's always a variety of pieces that are discussed. Like one is, are you looking for ubiquity? Are you looking for that fiber access or broadband access to be able for any household or business in the community to be able to have that access to it? Are you looking, how important is choice of multiple providers, onto it, or one provider that's regulated? What's kind of what are some of the goals of the choices, onto that? Which kind of lead into kind of what is the type of competitive environment that you're looking to try to facilitate and create in the community, and then getting into, what's the ownership? What elements, what layers of the ownership, because a lot of these different types of models, you can look at maybe owning the dark fiber and then attracting the investment for somebody to come with the network electronics, and doing that. What type of performance? Doug talked about the performance factors. It's not just speed, but you have to look at, the total capacity, latency, and all these other performance factors that evolve, that do that. And then the affordability, how do you measure, what's the measure of affordability? And then kind of what's your risk aversion and what are your goals for cash flow? And really kind of laying all those out, but really also understanding a lot of those objectives conflict with each other. For example, cash flow and ubiquity are very much in conflict with each other, because you're going to say, I'm going to build out to all the other areas where the private sector can't afford to build, but yet I want to offer a lower cost and that's more affordable. Those are conflicting objectives. And so you're going to have to make trade-offs and make decisions as you move forward and look at your alternatives.
And
Good.
that's Excellent. And then one other thing too is that if you do have a local competitor, oftentimes I've seen them, once you've made the announcement you're going to move forward and you're so well organized and you've got it all, you got your plan, they do a big slash campaign and they start, cutting their prices immediately and doing better customer service than they've normally had. And, but that's because it is money to them. So, excellent point. Terry, your last shot at telling folks what you think they should be asking themselves.
I'm in alignment with what Tom talked about. I mean, it's understanding yourself before you move forward to try to see where you're going, knowing what your strategies are, and again, bringing the community with you, because there is a lot of political risk if you go out there and your community doesn't understand what you're doing. And I think the three factors that we've got on the slide, balancing risk, control, and those are relatively easy to measure, but the benefits that it's going to bring to the community is also something that's not so easy to measure, but is a really important factor to be considered, especially in the long term.
Excellent point. Judge?
Well, a couple things on the community side of it and how to educate them. My advice in that is be very cautious and measure expectations, because it's been alluded to once already, I think maybe twice, that fiber's coming. That means it's going to be in my front yard. That's not true. So we need to make sure they're educated to it's not necessarily for sure coming. And the goalpost in this thing has moved a lot over the last 3 years for me as a county judge. Well, it moved again today. Every time I get in a room or have a conversation with smart people, I learn something that makes me change my thought process on it a little bit. Something that Tom said is private's not coming. There's not going to be the silver bullet guy come fly into our county that isn't a snake oil salesman that's going to say, hey, sign a franchise, give me a franchise agreement. Don't worry, I'll take care of all the easements with KU and AT&T, and we're going to dig this thing in, and we're going to offer your residents this great internet that they can put their selfie up like that and download stuff off the internet like that cheaper than what they're doing it now. So having said that, my advice is, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to hire Mr. Lawson, Tom, or a couple guys like you. I'm going to approach my neighboring counties to share the cost, work with my two cities and hope that those judges can, and where we can spread that out a little bit. And we're going to bring you guys in and say, here you go. Will it work or will it not?
Yeah,
That's the point I want to drive home, is get professional help. There are professional snake handlers out there, and I think two of them.
And I think to that point is kind of bringing in some neighboring county. Warren County in Kentucky is kind of an example. They've been looking at this, and what they did is they went out and reached out, or actually the Bowling Green Municipal Utilities and then Warren Rural Electric Cooperative kind of heard about it, and they went up to the county and said, hey, wait, before you kind of go off on a tangent, let's kind of look at how we could jointly do something together. So I think that's a very important point.
Well, and they just thought that was my one piece of advice, and we will talk about this a lot in these workshops, and is partnering. Look around you. Who's in the same situation you are? Who has a lot of the same common challenges that you are? And then look and say, who doesn't have? We have a lot of communities in eastern Kentucky that have fiber to the home. Yes, because they did get ERA funding, federal government funding, but they have built out that network. What on earth did they learn? And they've been in the telecom business for a long, long time. What's the knowledge base that they have? What do they know that you don't know as the head of a local government? Because lots of you know a local government they don't know, because they've been running a private business, if you will. So, but we all have in common our passion and our love for eastern Kentucky, and we all have in common a desire to make it a better place to live, and our children can stay here. So look around you for those partners. Look around you for those common folks and the expertise that's around us as well. And so I think that's a way to segue into your time of questions. And Larry is back there with his roving microphone. And My clock says we have about 12 minutes, Larry. And the one thing I did also want to, because you are aware of Lexington, and Terry has been very engaged with Lexington over the past 3 years, as they have 2 years or whatever, close to 3, deliberated on how they're going to move forward at, and even though it's much bigger than our towns in eastern Kentucky, there's still some, just want to make sure that he's been in the middle of all of that. So, questions from the audience. Now it's up to you. Right there. Doesn't sound like. There it is.
Oh, here, just grab this one and then we'll
there's
share.
one over
Oh,
there.
okay.
Gotta love the technology. It is. It's interfering with it, isn't it?
While Larry's sauntering back there, again, there are a number of handouts over on the table there, and the list that Tom went over is over there as well. So, you know, just make sure you do know that. Go ahead.
In a lot of the larger cities, there's free community, free public Wi-Fi. I'm wondering, in a small, low-income rural community, is there a way to make this fiber happen, and how would you make cash flow on that?
For a Wi-Fi network?
For free public Wi-Fi
Free public Wi-Fi.
in a very low-income community.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of ways that you could look at kind of a free, if you're looking a free type of service, you could look at, one is looking at saying, are you looking at to have kind of an area or like in the town hall or some effort there, some location there that you're looking at. That'd be a matter of can you, get access, what's your cost of accessing the internet today? Is there a connection that you can buy that would improve that access to that facility to allow a better thing? And it's a matter of putting up, kind of an access point in an area that people could work. If you were going to go out and try to bring it closer into kind of in a park area or other neighborhoods, you'd want to try to drive some fiber infrastructure into that area and then do your Wi-Fi access points off from that. It gets a little bit more problematic with Wi-Fi if you want to say, I want to try to offer a free indoor service in this neighborhood, because that you start having to drive your access points to be so deep into to penetrate and get communication into the house. It gets a little bit trickier onto that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind, and I'm still wondering how to pay for that cost. How does the municipality, if it's free, how are you doing cash flow on that?
Well, on that, if you're offering a free service, of course, you have no revenue stream coming in. Most of the times that I've seen our clients set up a free service, they look at it and say, it's going to be part of the IT budget, it's part of another budget of the city, that type of thing.
Just a
So they're
regular
not looking at,
item.
onto it. Some of them early on thought, well, we'll be able to sell advertising and splash pages and all that. You might be able to make a couple of dollars off of that, but it's not really anything of significance, onto that. So it's more on the free stuff. It's really more of saying, hey, it's just part of a city cost and part of doing operations and funding. And it's not, in going to that level, it's not a huge expenditure type of thing on that either. And then you also want to take a look, and can you also say, if I'm going to extend fiber out to these certain areas, what other cost avoidance costs can I have if I extend fiber to like the libraries and some of the other public buildings and some of those locations? You might be able to avoid some charges that would help pay for it too.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next question.
It's always a good sign, but you did good.
I noticed that there's not really a true Ammon, Idaho model up there. And we've been studying Ammon and Sandy, Oregon for the last 3 years. Matter of fact, if I could do just a quick thing, on September 15th in Moorhead, we're having the folks that did the Ammon model come here. They're flying in to do it for us. And we have a local board that is our broadband board trying to do the things that the judge has been doing as well. And it's free. If you all would like to come, I'll give you my card, and if we have to move it to a bigger room, we will. But the ones who went over their whole model and everything, they're going to come in and talk to us. But I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that, and also that's been successful for them as far as take rates and those type of things. And for our community, they're very similar in size, although they're a little bit challenged. They're not as challenged as we are in the rural part,
Yeah.
but in the town they are. And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and I think in terms of this, the model, the three models up here, they're just general frameworks. The Ammon model would probably more fit into that number three type of thing, because they're owning the fiber,
Right.
they're making an investment. You have a network operator that's coming in and operating it. That one of the things that they're doing as part of the funding is a lot different, where they're getting the users to pay a connection fee, to like a tap fee onto it. And when I talked like Tipmont, the RMC with Ron onto that, one of the things that they're doing is that when they serve part of like Lafayette area, Lafayette, Indiana, and all that, they found kind of a lot of their members, when they have other alternatives, they're not really willing to pay a connection fee, and so it kind of really depends on what how that would work. In the more rural areas where they're pretty well up to satellite and dial-up as their option, their membership are almost hanging out, willing to write $2,000-3,000 checks to pay a fiber connection fee. So, in the sense, there's some of the co-ops have actually kind of done that Ammon type model for a number of years already. So but that is kind of one of the pieces into that.
And just for those who might, Ammon, Idaho.
Idaho. Yeah,
Idaho is a town, is a community where the mayor took a lead and it's been a really interesting project. And we usually use that, Terry uses that a lot in his examples.
It's the Ammon model on YouTube. It's a
Yep.
20-minute video.
Yeah,
Yep.
and we think about showing it, but 20 minutes of video, it takes up a lot of time. But it is a good video for all of you to watch. Next question. No more questions?
Means we did good.
That does. I know it means they saw lunch coming in is what it means. One of the things I want to follow up, it was touched on, and just for a moment I want to mention it. And it's a challenge that has been a challenge. It's always been a challenge for municipalities, munis. It has been a challenge for your local telephone cooperatives, and it would be for your electric cooperatives if they were in it. And that is the marketing and the competition issue. As a government entity or a local board, you have to operate this network, and I think Doug alluded to it, Tom, everybody, in a competitive environment. The federal government, when I was at the Rural Utility Service, for the first time in history, gave us money to loan, not just to telcos, like Gearhart or People's Rural or whoever else is here, I think Mountain Rural, or not just to, but to municipals and to competitives and to startups. For the first time, we had to make loans into a competitive environment. The electric co-ops have always operated within their designated area. They know who their customers are, you don't have a choice. Telephone co-ops and independents have been the same in their designated area. All of a sudden, the federal government was told that we had to make loans into a municipal network. Let me tell you, the federal government agency that does it, we didn't even know how to advise a borrower about doing a market analysis. We had not ever had to do a market analysis to loan billions of dollars. So when you think about this as a municipality, you think about how you're going to be in this competitive environment. Not only the technology changes so frequently, but you're liable to have other competitors, and if you don't, they'll come in or they'll price compete with you, whatever. It's just an element that I think we can never sort of overstate as you're looking at planning, and it's the industry you're getting into is different than the industries that you may have already been involved in or the business models that you may have been involved in. With that, no more questions. I'm going to turn it, where's my sidekick, Larry Combs? But first of all, what a great panel. Give them a round of applause.